Hey, boys and girls, it is Nancy A. Shenker, aka the Geezerproofer. And as I always explain at the beginning of my episodes, there are two kinds of people in the world, and we sometimes fluctuate back and forth. Geezers are people who are stuck in their ways, not curious, afraid to take risks, whereas beezers, the antithesis of geezers, are people who be in the moment, be relevant, be active, be curious, and you could be a geezer or a beezer at any age. I have just chosen to talk about people over 50 because it is sometimes common for people of our age to just get settled in how we've always done things. And as the population ages, I look at my life and I say I have an entire lifetime left in front of me because the average life expectancy of women is now 87 and the number of centenarians is on the upswing. So it's especially fitting today that I have as my guest. And by the way, I am recording 100% remote from Annapolis, Maryland, which is something that I've challenged myself to do since launching my podcast in November, is getting over I'm not afraid of technology, but the whole fear of doing something new and different that I've never done before was kind of debilitating. And so now I think this is the first episode that I've actually done 100% remote. We did have about 12 minutes of technical difficulties, but they're now behind us and I've got my mojo back. So welcome, Bradley Sherman.
Thank you. I'm glad you've got your mojo back.
And Bradley and I actually met, like some of my other guests, on LinkedIn, where I was just following what Bradley was putting up and thinking, this guy is really smart and really does give me very different perspectives on aging. So, Bradley, if you can just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your history studying and geeking out on gerontology.
I don't geek out on gerontology as much as I geek out on demographics. I think like most people who got into aging, I got into it because of family. And it was my grandparents that really were the gateway drug into longevity and the broader conversation about demographics, because they were in their retired years during my formidable years, and they were in long-term care during my college years. And I got to see that whole transition play out in front of me. But the demographic side, the stuff that really gets me up every day and gets me excited, came about when I traveled between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., which is my adopted home. And I saw across the rural landscape of this country a new reality emerging, where there were simply a lot more older people, and especially a lot more older people doing the jobs in these places that younger people were doing in the cities, things like fast food and gas stations and cleaning toilets. And that sparked my interests, which led me to work at AARP for about 15 years, and then set out on my own with my own consulting practice known as Human Change, and a book called The Super Age: Decoding Our Demographic Destiny, which offers a blueprint for our society and our economy to move forward during this period of pretty rapid demographic change.
And can you just summarize like what that demographic change actually is?
Yeah.
I mean, the statistics, facts don't lie, and the statistics are pretty powerful.
Yeah, they're pretty shocking. So we've been in a period of demographic change now since about the 1760s. And I know that probably sounds like forever, but against the backdrop of human history, that's a blink of the eye. It's barely a drop in the bucket. It's a lot like climate change, and I'm always very cautious to equate any two megatrends, but climate change and demographic change have essentially grown up together. They're byproducts of the industrial revolutions and the advances that we've made in our societies. Top line, what has happened are two things. The first is that our birth rates are down. Our birth rates are down dramatically. In fact, they slipped again this year.
I
according
saw
to
that.
recent numbers.
Yeah.
And we're well below what we call replacement rate. And replacement rate means that on average, every woman needs to have about 2.1 babies. And this maintains the population. We are actually in a point now where we're well below that. In fact, we're at about 1.5, 1.6 now in the United States. So we're slipping as it relates to population growth amongst native-born populations. At the same time, we've seen this radical increase in human longevity. For most of human history, lifespans hovered around 35 years. And as you noted in your intro, we've blown that out of the water, doubling in some cases, tripling in others. Believe it or not, there are parts of this country where the life expectancy now is 97. And that's really a remarkable human achievement. But what that's done is it's changed the mix. It's changed the mix of our population. So just by the end of this decade, just in a few years' time, there'll be 1 out of 5 people in this country over the age of 65. We've never experienced that before.
And on top of that is we are healthier and more active and more connected, in part due to technology, in part due to medical advances, that whenever I say to people, I want to live to be 120, they immediately say, well, what about quality of life? And I said, didn't you ever see the movie RoboCop? I'll just have, fake teeth, fake body parts. Everything will be 3D printed. Wearables will compensate for any arthritis that I may have. So at the same time as the population is aging, age tech and medical advances are also advancing, because people who are getting older or caring for aging parents now have an incentive to improve that quality of life.
Sure. I think what we're seeing overall is that we're actually pushing a lot of healthy years into the middle of life rather than tacking on old, sick years at the end. We're still going to get old. We're still going to have some level of decline. It's been delayed significantly for a pretty significant chunk of the population. But it's really important, Nancy, for people to realize that everyone's longevity journey is different. If you've seen one 50-year-old, you've seen one 50-year-old. If you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old. And if you are in that middle to upper income category, your prospects of a very long, very healthy, very engaged longevity are actually pretty high. But if you're in those lower income brackets, your longevity prospects on average have really been stifled. We've seen all the recent longevity gains of the past, 50 years or so really being concentrated among top income earners. People who are lower income earners, they've been kind of stuck and haven't seen the same progress of people with more money and more resources.
Interesting. So what's your number? How old, do you think you would like to live?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think of life as a sailing journey, and I have a sense of where I want to be, and I know that I don't want to be in decline for too long. I think that is something that is quite common amongst high performers, is that they don't want to lose their relevance. They don't want to lose their pole position in society. They certainly don't want to slip into a period of decline where they can no longer take care of themselves. Or they may become a burden. So putting a number on it is next to impossible. It's more of a stage, I think. And I think the more that people realize that around their goals, the more likely they're able to take very proactive steps to achieve a really healthy and successful longevity.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important for us as a society to change the perception of aging. And that movement is beginning. And again, that's how you and I met, is we're part of this larger community that's pushing back when they see things that are ageist or stereotypical. And all of my listeners have heard me rail against Lifetime Fitness because their new Medicare policy is that people over 65 can take Aquasize anytime we want, but we can only work out in the gym between 9:30 and 3:30. And a friend of mine said, don't speak up, you'll ruin it for the rest of us.
Oh, right.
And I do think among aging populations, there is, and I know AARP, your former employer, I don't know if you still consult to them, has really been making an effort. I mean, the fact that AARP used to stand for the American Association of Retired People,
Right.
Like, what is retirement now? Like, I'm 68. Theoretically, I could retire, but why would I?
Yeah, and there's practical reasons for the shift at AARP and the shift in American culture, too. The 20th century was really a pretty terrible period for ageism. It grew exponentially. Really, I would say starting at the advent of Social Security about 1935, but really, really gathering steam by the mid-60s, where becoming redundant in old age became normalized. And that was common for about 30-ish years until the 90s, when I think a growing number of people at that time said, retirement isn't exactly for me. It's not a great deal. I don't like being on a fixed income. And since then, we've seen pretty dramatic return of older workers or the remaining of older workers in our workplaces. And what we can expect over the next, 10 years or so is that the number of people, or the percentage rather, of people over 65 in the workforce will grow by, at least a third. That's substantial. And for those over 75, it's gonna double. And these are based on government estimates, mind you, Department of Labor estimates, which tend to be conservative. So we could see a pretty significant sea change. And I believe that visibility is a big part of personhood and how we identify and how people see us. I think time and time again, during any big social movement, it's visibility that's really changed the game, whether that's the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the women's rights movement, the LGBT movement. I think that we've seen that happen over time. We're definitely seeing that now as it regards to older adults. Older adults are standing up and saying, I've got economic power, I've got political power. I want to be seen. I want to be heard. I want there to be accurate representations of me in media. And we are seeing the shift happen. I'm quite convinced, though, for some folks, it's not fast enough. And I wish we could just snap our fingers and everything changes overnight. But social change, true social change, takes at least a generation.
I know.
20 to 30 years.
Look how long it took LinkedIn to take down their ageist ads of like older people not knowing how to use the cloud. And it becomes, as you know, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And not to bash AARP, but I had an incident where I saw an ad for a social media manager at my local AARP. Mm-hmm. And I called and I said, would you consider hiring somebody who's not like 3 years out of ASU? I've been using social since 2005. And without even asking me, my salary requirements said, you'll probably want too much money. Yeah. And that to me is veiled ageism, because the reality is I would have taken the job for $30,000, which is probably a third of what a recent ASU grad would have asked for. But this preconception, even from within an organization that theoretically is supporting the needs and the perspectives of older adults. I have a lot of friends who've worked in corporate and they just don't want the responsibility anymore. Right. And they will be more than happy. Warby Parker actually is great at hiring people over 50. The Apple stores are starting to really open their doors.
Apple's done a wonderful job at this. And of course, you find certain businesses that have really excelled in both the recruitment and the retention of older workers, workers of all ages.
And in their advertising, again, because I come from a marketing background, I'm very, very attuned to, oh, this is a great bathing suit. Are they only showing it on size 0 18-year-olds?
Right.
Or do they have a woman in this bathing suit who's my age and postmenopausal, who has a little extra side fat? Like, would it look good on me? And that's a place where I actually think AI will be smarter than the ad agencies, because as a consumer, I could say, all right, let me see how this looks on my 68-year-old body as opposed to an 18-year-old body.
Well, and you've already started to see that some businesses have moved towards using artificial intelligence, or at least augmented reality, to allow for that, to see how clothes might look on you, to see how eyewear might look on your face. So again, it's change that's happening. It's happening slowly, too slow for some, maybe too fast for others, but it is happening regardless. And yeah, undoing bias takes time. And, I hear all the time from older workers, in particular, those who have slipped out of the job market and are trying to get back in, that same refrain. Oh, you're probably too expensive. Oh, the cost of your labor might be too high. Oh, you might have too much experience. There is no such thing as too much experience. And I've seen that happen so often in organizations where people come who might be in that semi-retired space to apply for a job that fits their life stage today, and they're turned away. And sometimes they don't even get an interview. And that baffles me. It happened with one of my managers not that long ago, where we had this guy who was a former administration official. I mean, he was just a whiz. And I thought I can learn everything from him. And my boss wouldn't even grant him an interview because he was too experienced. Now, that is weird. And that's contrary to where the future is going. Remember, pre 1965, we had very age diverse workforces because age diversity was just the norm. You worked until you couldn't. That was what the norm was for essentially all of human history, all of human history. In fact, as late as the 1950s, 1 out of 2 men over the age of 65 was in the formal labor market. 1 out of 2. It's about 25% today. It is growing, but it's only 25% today compared to 50% in the 1950s. So are we making the move back? Yes. But is it happening slowly? Also, yes.
Yeah, and especially among aging women, and I do think, people make subtle jokes about dad bods and they talk about, Donald Trump's gut. But I do think that the bar is much, much higher for women, and the pressure to look youthful and, be tech savvy and be kind of, be a cool older woman, whereas nobody's really counting, Al Pacino's wrinkles.
Well, that's correct. I think we also have to remember that this generation of women who are older now in the workforce, who are fighting against ageism, have been the tip of the spear for women in the workforce altogether. So their entire careers have really been consumed by breaking the norms. Right. Charting new paths for younger women who are coming after them in the workforce. So yeah, men still make a predominant number of executive positions in companies. They still make up a majority of board seats. It is still very cis. It's still very hetero. It's still very white. I mean,
yeah, and if you look at even the funding for women entrepreneurs,
it's pretty damning.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends who are women founders, and they tell me the number of times they were rejected or told, let me go back and check with my wife to see if this is a good idea. Yeah. It's like, whoa, like what year are we living in? Like,
yeah. And I think, for the challenges that are there, we sometimes get consumed with the negative and don't look at the overall positives. And the fact that women in midlife are still one of the fastest growing segments of the workforce, I think is a really good sign that we're headed in the right direction. the fact that we're seeing an overwhelming number of employers now offering things like caregiving leave is an overwhelming endorsement of the fact that women have a pretty substantial role, if not a very substantial role in the workplace. And then, you've got a whole new class of employers who over the past few years have started to put menopause benefits into place, menopause training into place. So again, I wish I was in a position to snap my fingers and make the world the way I'd like to see it. I'm not, unfortunately, but I do see positive movement in these directions. And I quite frankly think women who are in their 60s and 70s in the workforce today are really charting a course for the next generation in a pretty substantial way.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, Bradley. And thank you for bringing it back up to the positive movement we're making. And as a guy who's right in the middle of the numbers, you see the trend happening. Whereas
I should note, just because I think people sometimes miss this data point, at least in the big cities now, at least in places like New York and DC and Boston, Chicago, women are making as much or more than men at the start of their career now. So yes, there is still wage disparity. There's also racial wage disparity. Those things still exist if you take a look at the whole picture. But there are some real significant glimmers of hope here, some significant signs that we're moving at least in the direction of parity at the very least, in terms of the way the workplace works. Doesn't mean we don't have plenty to unwind. We do. Yep. Plenty to unwind.
And you mentioned the feminist movement, and I know it was fictionalized, but the TV series Mrs. America that talked about the feminist movement and the infighting that was going on within the movement, and that if I could wave a magic wand, to pick up your language and change something, women have to stop fighting with each other about who has the coolest anti-ageism platform.
Yeah. Well, that's outside of my pay grade.
but it does go on. And, the best place to see that is LinkedIn. Whereas if you or Chip Connolly or, there are any number of men in the aging space, for lack of a better term, say something, everyone's like, woohoo, that's great. If a woman says something, I would say there's probably like a 10 to 20% chance that somebody who is in the space but is either jealous or contentious starts trolling them.
Oh, really?
And it's not just me, because men aren't in the room where that's happening. They're just not. And having spent a lot of my career in male-dominated industries, my biggest detractors were not the men who were keeping me in a position. I mean, of course, there was sexist language and stuff that I would call out, but it was really the women, because of this kind of scarcity mentality that there can only be one queen bee, as opposed to let's all just band together. It's like the woman who said, don't complain to Lifetime because you'll ruin it for all of us. I'm like, no, all of us should be speaking up. Like we shouldn't just lie back and take it if there's a policy that is fundamentally ageist.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from my personal experience here, but I found that, certainly people like Chip and Michael Clinton have been very collegiate.
Yes, absolutely.
In the way we've engaged with each other. We have different lines of business, obviously, so there isn't really competition per se. We do share information on a regular basis and, promote each other's work. I will say this, the only people that I've ever really received hate mail from, and I have gotten some, have been older women. And it's been kind of disheartening to be called.
Yeah, and it's not a good look because it feeds into the stereotype that we're old and bitter and angry, and that a book I wrote a few years back called Bitch Slap: When Women Misbehave at Work. Yeah, and I like that. There are lots of reasons for it. We didn't necessarily grow up smacking each other with wet towels in the locker room, and we were trained to be good little girls. But we need to just get over that if we really are going to make change. And I like to sort of put myself in the same bucket as Gloria Steinem in the feminist movement, where I have the wire rim glasses. I
Right.
have the media. I'm like, I'm going to use my sense of humor. I'm going to use my voice. This is what I believe. You don't have to agree with me, but just like, don't hate on me. That's the bougie hippie in me.
Yeah. And I think that if there is a line drawn between, I think of a lot of things like Venn diagrams. So I think you've got the anti-ageism movement over here, and you've got the the reality of what's happening in the business opportunity over here. And there's a little bit of overlap, but for the most part, they exist almost in two completely different worlds.
Yes, and one is very academic, I think, and one is more pragmatic.
One's railing against the system, and one is working with the system.
Yeah, and I'm kind of probably somewhere in the middle.
You're in the middle of that Venn diagram.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I will rail, but I rail with a sense of humor and a sense of perspective. And, that I came under a lot of criticism with the title of my podcast. So my concession was creating this word geezer, because you could be a geezer. My 6-year-old grandson is sometimes geezerly.
Yeah. I also think that at some point, and I think I certainly applaud you for this, is that at some point there needs to be the ability for people to take ownership of negative words and make them positive words. There are plenty of words. I'm a gay man. We took back queer. We took back faggot, and those terms still make people uncomfortable today. But we've turned them from being very negative terms into being positive ones within our community. And I don't see why the same can't be done for things like geezer. I don't see why they can't be done for terms like old fart. Like, they make us cringe today. But at the same time, like, there's something empowering about taking ownership of those.
Oh, yeah. And I've built it into my lexicon. If I'm with somebody and they're like, I don't want to go to Europe because it's too much packing and unpacking, I'll just say, stop being geezerly. Like, try something new. And it's not a chronological age, it's a stage. And I will know that we finally have made progress when dating apps don't make you put your age on your profile as the first differentiator, and that they really base it more on stage and interest and energy level and vibe. Because I've met people who are younger than I am who are more set in their ways. In fact, quite a few people.
There's plenty of people in midlife, I can attest to this, that are stuck. And unwilling to jettison themselves into something new. It has nothing to do with your chronological age at all. The big challenge is, Nancy, is that all of our systems are designed around age. So unless there is some type of either greater understanding of the gradation of stage within age, and some corporate investment into better grasping it, which we still haven't seen yet, not in a kind of seismic way, we're going to be cycling on the same issues. What I have to say, though, is that I do see, and I had a long conversation with a very close friend of mine this weekend about this. Younger people, Gen Z in particular, have really seemed to some degree, shatter age stereotypes. They're sharing space both romantically, professionally, almost in a kind of collegial type way with people who are older than them. There's this interest in having multi-generational friendships. And, I think of myself as a Gen Z. That was kind of weird. We wouldn't have hung out with people who were much older than us in the 90s, in the early aughts. But it's not unusual now to have people in their 20s in my sphere.
Yeah, I mean, it actually started with Timothy Leary, when you think about it, that he was, there were some of these Sherpas back in the 60s and 70s who were old psychedelic dudes who were like the Pied Pipers.
For me, it's the normalization of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is when you really start to see culture change, like the things actually start to move. And for our current reality, where we've got these growing older populations, shrinking younger ones. Remember, we're 76 million boomers at their peak, and there's only 69 Gen Z at their peak. You're starting to see a greater churn because there are more older people in the workforce now working with a lot fewer younger people. And that natural churn is happening there. We know that boomers aren't leaving their homes. They are staying put in the places that they live. So the neighborhoods around them are actually becoming more age diverse as a result. People are pushing back on moving into seniors housing, trying to stay away from a nursing home as long as possible. I get that. That's not in my plan. So I can even see it within my own community that we've got a wide diversity of age here. People as young as their early 20s, excluding children, and all the way up to their mid 80s, all living within a block. And that would have been nearly unheard of, at least on this street 10 years ago.
Yeah, I just had a dinner for an organization that I'm part of called joinsos.org. And I had somebody in their 20s at my dinner and somebody in their 90s. And it was such a rollicking, great time. And
it's awesome.
You know, that's like a really good place to wrap up, is just, you know, to talk about the fact that I do believe that ageism will begin to dissipate as more people embrace intergenerational workplaces, intergenerational gatherings, whenever, and there is a time and a place for things for people over 50, but I would probably guess that some of my listeners, especially for the episodes on the vagina and the penis, that like knows no age. We've all got the parts. So, you know, there are episodes that I've done that really have attracted a wide range of listeners, and I'm hoping this one does as well. So, Bradley, if people want to follow you or learn more about your work, where should they go?
Sure. I mean, I think to start, you can reach out to me at behumanchange.com. My email is bradley@behumanchange.com. I try to respond to everyone that I can. I'm most active on LinkedIn, as Nancy, you know. But you can find me on other social channels like Instagram and TikTok. And for those of you who are looking for a more consistent news on what's happening in the world and the change we're experiencing today, I launched a media company earlier this year with my co-founder, Marcia Stepanek. We're an intergenerational team. It's called New Rules Media, and you can subscribe at newrulesmedia.substack.com. And we've got a podcast coming out later this year that I hope you'll tune in for.
That's great, Bradley. And, you know, as my listeners know, I always try to intersperse really smart, fact-based content with wild and sexy and raw and irreverent stuff. So you definitely met the quota for this.
I hope I made you proud.
Totally. And in closing, if you or somebody you know would be a good guest for the podcast, please send them my way. I'm now, as you can see, recording remotely. So I'm over my fear of audio recording. I was never part of the radio club in school, so this was just not my first language. But you can email me at thegeezerproofer@gmail.com. And we're booking now in May and beyond. So keep your recommendations coming. Nothing is off limits. And my guests have ranged in age from 20s to, I don't know who my oldest guest has been, but I'm welcoming of intergenerational guests as well, provided to, you know, echo something you said, Bradley, and it's a term I use all the time, is if you have something in common in the middle of the Venn diagram, like I did with one of my guests, we talked about destination dating, somebody else, we talked about health. So you don't have to be 50 to be on my podcast. I am not ageist, despite the title of the podcast. So thank you for listening. And you can find past episodes on Apple, Spotify, wherever you happen to get your podcast content. I'm no longer posting full episodes on YouTube and Vimeo, but you can find shorts there. And the full-length videos are available on request. So thank you all for listening. Thank you so much, Bradley. I will see you around LinkedIn. And remember to be a beezer and not a geezer. Peace out.
Ashley.